it's fair to say that the pricing consultation is very detailed. I can't remember the final page count. I think it was at least 130 pages long. And I think there's a slight sense that it's being developed with very little connection to the way things are currently being done in the industry and certainly the social housing sector. And it certainly raises lots of questions. So Bethan's call for, yep, we definitely want your thoughts and input into this. And we also know that this was one of your key concerns from the previous session. I think it came in at number one by quite some margin as the key concern. And I think I don't know if you had prescience about it, but yeah, having now read it, looked at it, filtered it all down into today's session, I think you were right to be concerned about it. But what I would say is, whilst the subject and the consultation is challenging, our aim is to make it as accessible as possible, easy to understand as possible, and to focus on some key things. Bethan's already mentioned one of them. The ultimate goal is to put together the response to the consultation from CHC and Welsh Housing Associations to Ofgem. So they are getting that feedback, and it's something that we've said before, is Ofgem is definitely very open to that. They do recognise that they are learning about the housing sector in particular. But some key things that we'll get out of today: what's the overall approach being taken by Ofgem, what this means for the sector, and obviously for you as individual housing providers, what are the main concerns that this raises for housing providers, and again, underline that point of, things that concern you, flag them now. What the sector really needs to be getting on with already. There are some, whilst this is a consultation, it has already started to get people to think about the things that they're already doing, because that's going to be one of the potential strategies for dealing with this, is that the sector needs to be doing their best endeavours to respond to this. What does Ofgem need to be made aware of? And obviously that final piece is pulling all of that together into response from CHC. I think it's a fairly safe bet that by the end of the session, your brains will be extremely full, and having a quiet lie down in a dark room would be an entirely understandable response. So on that basis, let's crack on. There's lots to cover. There is going to be a break. I usually forget all of the housekeeping, so I might wait for, or look to Rachel after we've done introductions to remind everyone. Bethan already mentioned a couple of things in there. There are some interactive opportunities for you to fill in forms and give your feedback on things as well. We'll obviously flag those too. So, quick introductions. Many of you have seen us before. I'm Nicholas Doyle. I'm a co-founder and director of Chirpy Heat. I've spent 30 years in social housing. I started as a housing officer in a large housing estate in Nottingham. For a fairly short period of time, I was also a tenant. Then I did a variety of different roles in the sector. My last proper job was 13 years at Places for People. And then went into consultancy, and we set up Chirpy Heat in 2019. I'm also non-exec of a small housing association as well. Rachel, do you want to do you and then fill in any gaps I've missed on the admin and arrangements?
Sure, yes. So I'm Rachel Mills. I'm another one of the co-founders and directors at Chirpy Heat. My background is sustainability. I've worked in domestic sustainability and energy efficiency for the last nearly 30 years. I also worked at a housing association as head of sustainability for a short while and became operationally responsible for their communal heat networks, which is out of that experience. That's one of the things that fed into the founding of Chirpy Heat. I am on the board of the Association for Decentralised Energy, which is a trade association for heat networks. And I'm also a founding member of the District Heating Divas, which is a women's business networking group for women working in the sector. I think there is an agenda slide in a minute, Nicholas.
Okay, Great. The usual call out to both Bethan and Rachel that if I keep going on for far too long, just to start raising your eyebrows slowly until they can go no further. The usual thing about us, I won't dwell on this for too long. The summary is we're principally housing people. We come from the sector. All of the founders worked in social housing, and the senior team also worked in social housing too. And that's one of the key parts of what we do, is always keep learning from the sector. We want solutions that work for housing providers. We don't sit outside doing, wonderful ivory tower solutions that don't link to the reality of working in the sector. We're obviously heat network experts. We've now worked with well over 100 housing associations and local authorities, and a few private sector ones as well across the country, and we've been gathering up all of that information. We also work with lots of organisations on heat network issues, as well as working with Ofgem, DESNZ and others on the development of the policy. What we want to be is to make sure that we understand more than even they do on heat networks and housing as well. And the final principle for us is our independence. We don't do anything else. We don't sell widgets. We don't do metering and billing. We don't do anything else except look after our clients and support them on the journey to hopefully better heat networks. Right, that's the less of the corporate flannel. Let's get on with the real stuff here. So the agenda for today is to go through all of the details around the regulatory and pricing, the context for the regulatory and pricing consultation, the details around the fair pricing consultation, so the fair pricing framework itself, things like cost allocations and other very detailed sections in the consultation as well. Then starting to develop the CHC consultation response. And then at the last bit, some key things that lots of housing providers are now starting to look at. Some of them are positive, some of them are defensive, some of them are just things that we need to start thinking about, even if some of the consultation suggestions are changed. There's likely to be some key things in there that will remain as part of the pricing mechanism for heat networks. Right, let's do a quick bit of the pricing context. So we'll skip through that one. So where are we on our wonderful journey to heat network regulation? It feels like it's coming thick and fast now. It was one of those classic things that went slow, fast, and all of a sudden we're starting to see lots and lots of things coming through. But just to remind everybody, 1st of April, the first phase went live with the consumer advocacy and redress schemes being put in place. Citizens Advice and Consumer Scotland up and running. They now have teams to support consumers on heat networks, and we're already starting to see I can't avoid the word complaints, issues coming through. And interestingly, cost and pricing is one of the main things that they are seeing coming through already. And then also to support that is the Energy Ombudsman, so another ombudsman for the sector to deal with. A slower start for them. Obviously, they're going to deal with complaints that aren't being resolved, and their timeframes are slightly different. The one we're in at the moment, which of course is the fair pricing consultation, goes on the 9th of July, so not far away, but again, giving us a reasonable time frame. And then I'll quickly run through these just so you get a sense of where we are in this. Summer 2025, we should, it's always caveated, have their government response on the consumer protections that they've published. And then the big one is going to be hopefully over the summer. It's been put back several times already, which is the minimum technical standards consultation, heat network technical assurance scheme, or HENTAS, or as they keep insisting on calling it, HNTAS for some particular reason. And then there's a couple more consultations that are going to come out, but the big one, of course, is that we've got the go live on 27th of January 2026, and then we've got a year really to get up and running to make sure that all the pieces are in place and reporting to Ofgem, because that's when it starts to get proper and serious within 12 months on the 27th of January 2027. So One item we're looking at today, still lots to work through. We can probably touch on some of the work that we've been doing with Ofgem and DESNES as well. What I would say is CHC has done a fabulous job in terms of engaging on this subject. Other parts of the country have not been quite so good. I think it's one of the themes that we raised in the previous session is that this is one of the rare opportunities for the sector to actually input into how the regulations are going to look, both because we've got the timescales, we know this is coming, but also because of that point I made earlier is that Ofgem are listening and are keen to get people's views on this, and are also critically are responding as well. It's all well and good asking for people's views, but it's no good if they just simply ignore them. But that's not the sense that we get. They're trying to do their very best to understand the housing sector. So this is a real opportunity for us. And I know it's really difficult for people to find the time and the headspace to think about these things, to input into them. But a small amount of input now could potentially have a big potential payoff for the sector as we move forward. So yeah, fully support CHC's approach on this. It's been very, very encouraging. Next slide, please, Rachel. A dangerous slide this, because one of the things that we will find is that we have a lack of information and data broadly across heat networks. But here's the best punt that we've got based on most of the work we're doing with people across the country. We know that only about 15 to 20% of heat networks are currently individually metered. And the current regulations, the heat network metering and billing regs, which came in 2015, didn't touch pricing. It wasn't part of any of those regulations. That's obviously going to be folded into the full regulations. But most clients we work with set a standing and variable charge as part of their tariff setting that they do. And we suggest that best practice is to review that annually and to give 30 days notice to consumers as well. There's much variation in that. We've certainly come across housing providers, I don't think in Wales, that haven't looked at tariffs and how they've set them for over 10 years. Big risk. Previously, lots of schemes losing money as a result of that, but that's clearly going to be a major regulatory risk going forwards. And that's obviously meant that that schemes haven't been closely managed, and you have unintended consequences to that, mostly in terms of those losses. And of course, the social housing provider is very aware of fuel poverty risks. This is going to be a real tension as we go through the fair pricing consultation about what can be charged for, how it's going to be charged, and what the actual impacts on the end consumer are going to be. Because there will be consequences for end consumers. At the moment, it's slightly in a vacuum that Ofgem are just considering that fair pricing will only end up being great for consumers. But I think there is potentially some downside on this. Most of the sector, the rest of the sector pays a flat, can't say that, flat fee through the service charges, and usually just apportioned based on dwelling numbers and size, for example. So bedrooms, number of bedrooms, or meters squared. There is an ongoing discussion about the unbundling of heat costs from service charges, mostly driven from a concern about people being evicted for heat charge arrears more than anything else. It's an ongoing discussion, and I don't think there is necessarily a clear solution to it. But we are still working with Ofgem and the sector on trying to work that through as well. Next slide, please, Rachel. Okay, just to underline that point from the last session, where we asked CHC members what was the hot topic, and just so it's clear, fair pricing was the top one by some margin in all of this. And the response in the CHC consultation was, we agree in principle with high-level fair pricing principles outlined, but are keen to understand more details through the subsequent consultation. There is a risk that if this is developed poorly, that heat networks will not be viable and will have to be replaced with alternatives such as direct electric heating. Well, that was an extremely good summary and response to this, and lots of those issues have now come out as a part of the detail that we now have in the consultation. So we've got to deep dive, unpick all of that, and then bring it back up so that we can start putting in place some more detailed responses on this particular consultation. Okay, over to you.
So what we wanted to do before we get too far into the detail is to gather some information about how you currently do pricing at the moment. When we do responses, it's great to include graphs like the one we just showed, or verbal feedback, written feedback, because the government doesn't have much evidence. So we'd like to invite you to do a short survey. There's not very many questions, but if you could do it now, you can either take a photo of the QR code on your phone. Nicholas is going to put that into the chat, the URL. You can just click on that as well then. And we'll just give it a couple of minutes for people to fill that out.
I, of course, knew that I would forget to do that.
While
Just
people are
so
doing that, sorry,
No,
I was
I
going to
was
say
just
that.
going to say again to underline that that point. Whenever we raise things with Ofgem and DESNZ, the first response is always, well, we need the evidence to support that. So this is really, really important. They absolutely love having that feedback from the sector to support their position. So yeah, it's currently a data desert for them in terms of what is actually going out there. So this is absolutely gold in terms of supporting that consultation response. Sorry,
Yeah.
Rachel.
I was going to say just answer the questions the best you can. If you don't know, that's also fine. There is already a question in the chat from Nick Abbott, which we'll just take now while people are doing that. So, are Chirpy part of or able to access discussions work of the external stakeholder advisory group? So this is a group that Ofgem has put together, and really to have discussions about parts of regulation that they're about to consult on where they want further input. It meets fairly infrequently. I think it's met maybe 3, possibly 4 times in the last 12 to 18 months. When it first started out, I made the case actually that they needed to have social housing representation on it. You then had to apply. So first of all, we had to make the case that social housing should be on the group. Then you had to submit an application to join it. And the approach they are taking to this, they're trying to keep the group quite tight. And so they are just having like one social housing representative, one private housing representative, one developer, one metering billing person, so all the sectors are represented like that. And each representative has a reserve. You have a backup person. So I also run a group called the Heat Network, which is a forum for social housing providers to talk about heat networks. And through that, we've become a trusted voice for Ofgem and DESNZ. Community Housing Cymru are also members of that group. And so is the National Housing Federation, and so is the LGA, and so is the National Housing Maintenance Forum. So there's other sort of trade bodies are members of this sort of forum. And so I have the principal social housing seat on that Ofgem forum, and the National Housing Federation is the reserve. But we sort of cascade information up and down to members through that way, and we would share with Bethan as well. I would say I don't think the policymakers are aware of the differences in the housing sector in Wales. And I think this is something that has begun. I know that Bethan's been talking to the Welsh housing regulator about this. Like we don't even think they understand that there's different, the Renting in Wales Act and things like that. So there are some differences. So it is really important that we do make sure the Welsh voice is heard. So short answer is no, Welsh voices are not represented on that group at the moment, but social housing in a broader context are. There's a question about unbundling as well, but I'm just going to go across here and see what the answers are
Well,
like.
while you're doing that, I'll answer Nick's question. That's an exciting question you've put in there, Nick. I'm slightly conscious that the session is being recorded. I'm slightly tempted to do that. I couldn't comment. Could I possibly? Could I on response to this? I don't think so. In terms of unbundling as a way of increasing individual metering, there is a broader sense that they do want more individual metering, absolutely, but I think there is genuine concern, having spoken to both DESNZ and people at Ofgem about this issue that they believe is something that is happening reasonably frequently, is that because people's heat charges are bundled up with other service charges and then people are being evicted. I don't have any numbers on that. I'm not sure where the numbers that they're getting are coming from. I know there's some information that's going to citizens' advice on that, but I don't have sight of that either. So I think there is genuine concern. I don't think it's cover for rolling out more individual meters. But I think it's up to us really to provide the evidence, or the evidence of the potential impacts of unbundling it at this point, or the complexity of unbundling it. I think that's the question. They've got a concern. Well, we've got to come up with an answer to that. But you're absolutely right. There is obviously a longer term aim, and hopefully we can argue it needs to be longer term for individual meters to be installed. Even if we argue that there need to be some areas that have exemptions to that, like we did under heat network metering and billing, so supported housing, extra care being excluded from individual meters. Just to be clear, they are not going to be excluded from full regulation, but there is still, I think, an argument that they should be excluded from individual meters, but we're nowhere near that discussion at this point. Rach, is there anything you want to reflect on the responses?
Well, I was just going to quickly flick through them. If you're still answering the survey, do carry on and complete it. But just so you can see the sort of the temperature in the room. So if you have metered schemes, do you have a written heat tariff policy? 11%, I can't work out the maths, but not very many do, and this is going to become something that's required, as you'll see shortly. How often do you review the tariffs? A bit of a mix there. This is probably one person, isn't it? So one every 6 months, one every year, one every 2 years, one less frequently than that. So again, a real mix, quite interesting to see. What do you include in your tariff? So the fuel is included. There's an admin overhead here, don't know. Quite often metering and billing and scheme efficiency losses are included. It might be the people we have in the room aren't the tariff setting people. Normally we would expect the top three of these, and then less so admin and sinking fund. Anyway, all good stuff. Non-metered, do you account for, size of the homes in any way? So number of bedrooms or metered squared, I think that's going to come in as well under the fair pricing. There's going to have to be some sort of tell for, a proxy for consumption. And then there's a bit of questions here about communicating with customers, which we'll take away, and anything else you want to add there. Right, I'll swap back to the. So if you haven't quite finished yet, do carry on while we go on. So we're moving on to the detail of the fair pricing consultation now. When you get the slides, this is the link to the document. It's actually an Ofgem consultation, so it's all on there, and the deadline is in 1 month's time. So it's the 9th of July. And this is quite a complicated slide, but this is a slide that Ofgem is using to explain the whole sort of fair pricing framework. And we're going to talk through these. This is actually taken from a webinar they did last week. Um, and we're gonna talk through these at a fairly high level. As Nicholas says, it's the consultation is over where I think it's 120 pages, something like that. But first of all, there was an authorization condition, which is the rule book. It's authorization condition number 4, which says that pricing will be fair and not disproportionate. You will become very familiar with those terms. There is this fair pricing objective, principles, and outcomes, which we're going to look at. This will take up all of the before break time, looking at what those principles are and what impact that might have on you and the extent to which you're following those principles already. Um, they're also going to issue guidance on all of this to help because it's principles based rather than strict rules. They're going to issue guidance and best practice to help people, navigate their way through something that does not have hard and fast definitions, just principles, which can be difficult when you're trying to prove compliance, and especially internally, how is that going to land with your compliance teams? There is going to be a fairness test, which I'll touch on in a moment. And then the sort of other stuff that we've put in a bucket, there's loads of stuff about how they're going to do benchmarking, how they're going to explain to customers, that's this central price transparency in this dark blue box. How are you going to show customers what their prices are compared to others? For-profit heat networks, there will be profitability assessments to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of the fact it's a monopoly system, and price investigations as well. So they will go after the outliers. Basically, they will do some benchmarking, find the outliers, do further tests, and collect more data from those, and then they do have powers to take action if it does prove that they are not fair and not disproportionate. But we're going to touch on these at a fairly high level. So that all of this stuff is basically the contents page of the consultation. I also just want to mention this easy retrofit. So Nicholas, if you could pop this one in the chat as well, it's the tiny URL. This is just another way for you to jot down your thoughts as we're going through the slide deck. I'm just going to shift over here and show you. It looks like this. So there's the different columns. There's one topic on the fair pricing framework, which we're going to do before the break, cost allocation, and then sort of everything else we're going to do after the break. And if you want to add any thoughts, if you think of anything that is very specific as we're going through these, you just go to these, you press the little plus button and you get a little sort of post-it note and you can type in there and save it. And then we can sort of, it's anonymized and we can just capture, your sort of thoughts as we're going through. So either thoughts, concerns, evidence, anything like that, just feel free to put it on the on this board. So fair pricing framework, as I've said, the objective is that consumers pay fair and not disproportionate prices. And this is what they want the consumer outcomes to be. So as well as not having disproportionate pricing, they want to incentivize efficiency and make sure there's an appropriate quality of service, make sure there is transparency in order to give consumers confidence, protects future confidence. They use a phrase in the consultation that's called a temporal mismatch, temporal meaning over time. So they don't want people who move into a new heat network early to pay a lot of money, and then the upfront, and then sort of subsequent consumers in the future pay less money, because that would be a temporal mismatch. It's just like if tenants and leaseholders are paying for repair works right now that consumers in the future are going to benefit from, how do you square that temporal mismatch? So there's quite a lot of stuff in the consultation about that. And they also want to make sure that consumers are not duly disadvantaged compared to people with other sorts of heating. Mainly, at the moment, what they're comparing it to is gas boilers and heat pumps, but in the future, gas boilers will phase out. Interestingly, as well, there is also an industry outcomes, industry being the heat network industry, and that is that they don't want to discourage the growth of the heat network sector, especially in England, to do with zoning. So that's where they want a lot of investment coming into district heating schemes. And so whatever they do to protect customers, they also want to make sure that that investment still flows inwards. So that's what the government is trying to balance. So there are six principles in the fair pricing framework, and I will touch on each of those now. So the first one is that there should be cost reflective pricing, and that means that the prices that are paid by the customers should be reflective of the underlying costs of the heat. So it means that you shouldn't just be lobbing other stuff into the heat tariff that isn't actually part of providing the heat to the customers. So that's the question we asked. Your fuel prices can go into there, an efficiency charge, metering and billing, because that's all part of, paying for the cost of the heat networks. But you couldn't put in something totally random. I can't think of an example, but you couldn't put in a big profit margin, for example. Well, you can make profit, but it has to be in a reasonable amount of profit. So that's one of the things. It has to be reflective of the underlying costs. One of the issues we've got at the moment is plenty of housing associations are not even charging the underlying costs. So they are undercharging, maybe because they don't know what those underlying costs are, or because they haven't been updated very recently. So there is a certain amount of loss going on. And there is a risk that if everybody goes, oh, right, this has to be reflective, and the costs could go up massively for customers, which brings sort of fuel poverty risks as well. So that's a thing we just need to be a bit delicate with. You could, of course, actively choose to undercharge your customers. But I think as we move to regulation and as the whole heat network industry becomes more professionalized, it will have to be an active choice rather than just something you weren't really aware of. So that's the first one. The next one is cost efficiency. So the underlying cost should be efficient while providing this appropriate quality of service. So it is up to you really to make sure you're getting value for money for your customers because it is a monopoly. So that would include implementing technical efficiencies that will mostly come through the technical standards or HENTAS, how you procure your fuel, whether that's gas or in the future electricity, or you might have biomass. And also outsourcing contracts where beneficial, perhaps repairs and maintenance, metering and billing, and make sure that those are really proactively managed as well to make sure you don't just let the contract and then all the KPIs sort of slip away. So that will be another principle. Number 3 is about fair and reasonable returns. So it will be a principle that you can make some level of profit if you are a for-profit heat network operator, which housing associations aren't. And this is all about the industry outcome. They want to be able to provide owners and investors with a fair return on their investment, but it shouldn't be excessive. So that is going to be a principle that's enshrined in these rules or in this guidance. The next one is that you should strive to maximize consumer benefit by making it affordable. And that should be applied throughout the whole way that you think about pricing, from how you design it, how you decide to do the charging, and then what they actually pay. Affordability needs to be a principle that is front of mind. Number 5 is regulatory control. So that's even if you outsource some of the roles in doing the pricing, you are ultimately responsible. So if you do outsource your metering and billing or your repairs and maintenance or any of the other jobs in running a heat network, it is you that will be held directly responsible. And that is because you are the regulated entity. And then the last one is price transparency, and this is about communicating to customers. I'm going to touch on that in a bit more detail later, not too much detail. I went to a 2-hour workshop seminar that Ofgem ran last week just about this, communicating to customers. I'm quite into it, and it was blew my mind a bit. But what's useful, what's accessible for customers, the pros and cons of all the different ones, making sure it's statistically robust and doesn't lead to confusion. I mean, there was a lot of thinking going into it. But broadly thinking, I think as well, it will be part of the benchmarking. You'll just pour data into Ofgem, and this sort of benchmarking and some of this price transparency will arrive. But you also need to be able to communicate to your immediate customers about the prices as well. And that would also be part of the consumer protection. There's some stuff about how you communicate with customers, so it's all bound together. So as I mentioned before, there is an outlined there is a draft authorization condition for fair and not disproportionate pricing. As I've said before, it is principle based, and those two terms are not predefined. So they're not going saying this is fair, this is not fair, this is proportionate, this is disproportionate. What they wanted to do is combine all of these things, all of the principles and all of the evidence for the benchmarking and all of those different bits and bobs and all the price investigation. And then as a whole, by comparing it to lots of other examples and segments and other housing associations in other parts of the market, comparatively it is fair and not disproportionate. So there's not a black white, this is in, this is out. The standards the standards they're going to set are what they would reasonably expect of a prudent regulated entity that is well run. So again, this is them thinking about how do we do stuff in the gas and electricity markets and how can we patch that across to heat networks. When they come to judging if something is fair and not disproportionate, it will be on a case-by-case basis because there won't be this black and white yes or no. They'll be taking lots of circumstances into account. And certainly, as I've said to begin with, they're going to be looking at the outliers. The actual price investigation stuff won't start until January 2027 because they know that they need to collect lots of information in order to be able to tell if, compared to everything else, if it's disproportionate or not. And as I've sort of mentioned, they're doing lots of work on statistical and economic models to work out what's the best way to compare what is basically apples with oranges across the heat network market. It's very difficult. It's such a diverse market. But they're going to issue lots of guidance, and all of that guidance will be consulted upon. So this is going to be a summer of lots of consultations, I think. I did say about the fairness test. This is really just in here. So when you get the slides, you can see it. This is what they're going to do to tell if something is fair or not. So first of all, they're going to look at the benchmarking. That's a 1.2 here. They're going to see how your prices would benchmark. They're going to look at who is affected by the potentially disproportionate prices. And then they're going to see if, how it's all structured, if there's any cross subsidization, if your tariff design is, reasonable. So this is what the test will be. So they'll look for the outliers and then they will apply these tests. So this is just for information. And I do not expect any housing association tariffs to be an outlier. At least to begin with, they'll be the for-profit schemes, and those looking to make a buck. So there will be a delay in this stuff coming to us. There's also information in the consultation about market segmentation, and there is a specific question, a consultation question about it as well. The segmentation information is interesting. In the consumer protection consultation, they just talked about market segmentation as large heat network operators, small and not-for-profit. And we're still waiting for definitions of what large, small and not-for-profit are. So if you take not-for-profit, for example, is it the organization that is not-for-profit? Or is it the heat network is not for profit? And, that can have lots of different combinations. So we're still waiting for that. But I think this shows all the different ways they're thinking of segments. And it's not like you will just be in one bucket. So when marketing people are doing segments, you might be an early adopter, or you might be a sort of a person in their 20s with no kids yet, or you might be a dual income, and you tend to fall into one bucket. I think with this, it's like a matrix, and everybody will switch yes, no on lots of different market segments, and have, what could be quite a unique profile. So how big is your heat network? Is it big or small? Is it metered or not metered? Is it profit or not profit? Are you an operator or a heat network supplier? Who's living there? When was it built? Pre or post 2014, 2015, when the metering and billing regs came out? So there's all these sort of things that are going to switch on and off. And this is what they mean when they talk about market segmentation. Again, I think it's quite complicated. It's quite nuanced. I think we're still waiting for more information. I think it would be quite difficult for customers to navigate if they're going to use this as a way for people to access the information about benchmarking. It's quite complicated. I think it is good that they are recognizing there is it is a complicated market, and something, a small communal heating scheme in mid Wales is going to be very different from a big district scheme in the middle of London or on the outskirts of London. So it's good that they are recognizing all of those things, but it still, waiting to see exactly how it's all going to fit together. Absolutely key to all of this is going to be data, which is what we said last time we were with you as well. They've started to list out some of the data they will want to collect in order to do the fair pricing work. So charges, obviously, what are your standing charges? What are your unit rates? If you are connecting to a district heating scheme, what those connection charges are? Are there any one-off charges? How much do you pricing? How much you charge to your customers? How many customers are there? What costs are you allocating? Cost drivers, those are the things that are impacting your prices that you might have less control over, like technology type, or if you're in a zone in England, or if it's metered and non-metered. And all of these things will have different frequency of reporting. Some of the things will have to be reported as part of the consumer protection reporting anyway. But it's just, more data that you're going to have. And you're going to have to report on some, as it says, quarterly, some annually, some might be one-off stuff, maybe when you register, or Ofgem could do a request for information in RFI and just ask for stuff on a one-off basis. And then the consultation questions, I'm not going to dwell on these, but just so you've got them when you get the information pack. So these are the questions that they're asking, as you can see there. What do you think about the principles? What do you think about the fairness test? Does what we're proposing reflect the policy intent? Some stuff about market segmentation, and some information about data specifically, what of these bits of data are you already collecting? What could be easily to report? What's more challenging? I think that's quite an interesting area that we can feed back on possibly. So I'm going to pause there and ask if there's any questions on that section. Anything in the chat?
A couple of questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to reflect on them? Okay, so Nick Abbott, a couple of points here. An interesting question arises around Principle 3, the potential for social housing operator and supplier with both social housing customers and private commercial customers. Could you have two tariffs, one with profit margin included for the commercial customers, possibly to subsidise the social customers? Yeah, well, that goes to the heart of a lot of the issues, doesn't it, in their definition of not-for-profit. And I don't think they're anywhere near nailing this, because there clearly could be not-for-profit housing associations that have for-profit heat networks, for example, and that doesn't necessarily just mean Section 106. It could mean, other stuff. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting one for them to work through. And what that means in terms of the ability to charge more. You could argue that it would come down to the housing provider, right? They've got to justify that to the end consumer ultimately, and Ofgem doesn't need to set out if there are different charging principles for not-for-profit and for-profit, for example. I would suggest that most housing providers on their affordable housing would not charge a profit, and may possibly charge on their other schemes, but may choose not to, for example. So I think your point is the right one, Nick.
If I can come in on if I can just come in on that, actually.
Yeah, please,
somewhere else in the consultation, and I can't put my finger on it right now, but there is a point about not allowing cross subsidization, and that's something they want to avoid. And I think what you're suggesting there, that would be, as you've said, it would be a cross subsidization if that was to happen. But there is also, this is one of the things, for sort of unpacking, because I know at least two housing associations who, and also one local authority, who just have one pooled heat tariff. So they don't have a different heat tariff for every scheme. They just have one heat tariff for the entirety of their portfolio, which means those living on the better performing heat networks are cross-subsidizing those on the poorer performing heat networks. Their reasoning is that quite often you don't get to choose where you live. If you are a social housing tenant, you have to take the property that comes up. And so that's their rationale behind that. I think the other issue on cross-subsidization is that, and this is going to come up when we come to cost allocation as well, is that if you are making a lot, the only other place you're getting money from is your rent income, right? So basically, all of your customers are subsidizing heat network customers if you're not charging your heat customers enough money. Nick, do you want to come in?
I was just so thank you, Nicholas, for your answer and your reflections there as well, Rachel. I was specifically thinking about a mixed network, and
Hmm.
rather than potentially operating
Yeah.
some for profit, you could maybe be in a future world where you become an operator of, say, a district network based on housing stock, particularly for LSVTs that are in one geographical area, so
Mm,
lots of concentrated stock. And the heat strategy in Wales and all sorts of other stuff would mean that you would want to connect other customers to it to create the base load to make it run. But you'd have a tariff for your social homes that reflects the fact that, say, sinking fund capital maintenance costs come through rent.
yeah.
But for your commercial customers, where you've maybe forced connection to the heat network under all of the relevant, we have to connect people, you'd
Mm,
be charging them a different tariff. And it was that mixed network. So you could have scope, A, for proactive cross subsidization, make the heat
mm,
cheaper for social homes by charging commercial customers who can bear the load. Effective,
hmm.
redistribution, which is what we have in public policy anyway. But also just the complexity, even if you didn't want to do that, of actually justifying, no, it genuinely costs this non-social housing person more because of all of these things that we have to recover. But that would mean unpacking the whole rent settlement. So there was two elements to it, and I maybe
Yeah,
didn't
I
explain that.
think you're right. I think at a high level, and I think those sorts of models will come out. I think if you're connecting to district heating, I absolutely think there will be different tariffs across the district heat scheme. And because uh, the actual buildings might have different efficiencies. There might be lots of different things. So I can absolutely see that happening. What I think is more difficult, and we would advise against, but I don't think this is what you were suggesting actually, is if in one block of flats you're charging different rates. So if you had leaseholders and tenants in one block of flats, in our experience, everybody talks to each other, and there's WhatsApp groups and stuff, and like, oh well, why am I paying more than that person? And so we sort of suggest that if there are different costs that leaseholders have to pay, for example, repairs and maintenance and those sorts of things, that goes into their service charge rather than into the tariff.
What about commercial units in a block of flats that also
Commercial
receive the
units.
benefit? And they're not even domestic tenants. They're completely commercial. So you've got commercial units, shops, cafes, whatever in the bottom, which is quite a common design now, like you see in continental Europe, domestic above commercial or even mixed.
Mm.
I'm sorry, I just keep
Yeah,
throwing
yeah.
these
I
problems out
think
there,
I
but
think I think there could definitely be different prices for non-domestic commercial customers. I think, yeah, yeah.
I'm glad you came on, Nick. I wonder if you could outline your second question here. Yeah, could you just underline what you're saying there?
yeah, I think I was just broadly agreeing with what Rachel said about it's unlikely the social housing sector would be an outlier, except there's this, and I didn't get Ofgem to commit to anything in their webinars when I sort of asked the question and tried to push them on it, because they're very good at not answering questions in those webinars, I found. But other than saying, yeah, we'll make sure we're aware of it, which was that yeah, you might not be an outlier, but if you've got either really poor energy procurement practice, just you're really bad at it, or actually it's quite challenging. So let's accept we're all quite good at it. But the size of an entity means it just can't get good deals. I mean, there are organizations that are buying, 9, 10 gigawatts of or megawatts of electricity, and others that are buying, very small amounts. Um, so you're naturally going to get differential input costs. And you could actually there's a risk I see, and maybe I'm wrong. I guess I'm asking whether you see it, that you've got maybe small suppliers or operator suppliers that have got quite high costs and are going to look like outliers. And
Mm,
even if it's investigated and it's proved not to be, that transparency of data is going to say, oh, well, you know, the Nick Abbott Housing Association with 2 blocks of flats is a real outlier. It charges them twice the price of heat for people who live next door in this, you know, 250,000 unit housing association that can
Yeah.
buy the energy. And the second part of it there was just, I think you've already reflected on, Rachel, actually, which was about whether Ofgem's going to look at the wider issue of cross subsidization from rent. You've got general rent income subsidizing, and how are you going to tackle that, particularly in an organization that proactively says, no, we are going to do this because it's what we're about and we can afford to do it.
Yeah.
We're not
Yeah.
disproportionately affecting people paying rent, but we are benefiting those in real fuel poverty by offering them a subsidized heat tariff.
Yeah. In the break, I'll have a quick look for the cross subsidization bit in the consultation.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted one of the things that we'll come on to later, Nick. It is the lack of data that we've got. So that what Ofgem has done is use the knowledge and experience of the retail gas and electricity markets and trying to deal with some of the issues in there. But we have to remember that that is a commodity market, not an infrastructure market. And also it's been in existence, you know, even before privatization, for, you know, 70 years, right? And it's been privatized since the 1990s. So that has built up over time. Heat networks are not a commodity market because you have to have the infrastructure to generate the heat. So it's a little bit, dare I say, more like Ofwat in some ways, the pricing for that. And Ofwat takes a very, very different approach. Theirs is a kind of a cost plus approach to this. And I think all of that information about, you know, the different cost bases for smaller housing providers, or those that have just, you know, just by chance inherited really badly performing heat networks that just simply have poor efficiency, and in order to bring up that efficiency would cost millions, which would be disproportionate. You know, that again, that would be like, you know, a water company that just so happened to have the worst sewage system in the UK, but it would then have to put its prices up massively in order to improve that. So I think that's part of the discussion, that we need to, you know, slightly reframe the way that Ofgem are thinking about this, because it is a different challenge that they've got here. And I totally get how they've created this, you know, blank piece of paper, well, with their experience of retail gas and electricity, and gone, okay, this seems to work in this market. Why don't we start using these principles in this market? Our job, unfortunately, now as a sector is to go, well, yeah, we agree with the principle of fair and proportionate. Everyone does, right? Motherhood, apple pie. But it's more complicated than that. And at the very least, you need to have the data on which to build those principles, which they currently don't have. So I think, yeah, ongoing discussion if I'm being very positive about it. But the challenge, of course, for the sector is to make sure that, you know, in your example of an outlier, that they aren't then punished because of, you know, something that isn't their fault or is entirely legitimate. You know, citizens advice or the energy ombudsman, you know, takes them through that whole process, you know, which is expensive in itself. It's, you know, it is a cost, and, you know, financial cost as well as resourcing and staff cost, only to get to the point where they go, oh, okay, yeah, we understand where that is. You know, how do we build that background data? Well, we can't hopefully do that on the basis of working through thousands of cases that citizens advice and the energy ombudsman goes through. It's much better to have built that data up in the first place, then the principles behind it, then we can actually have something that reflects the reality of the world. But, you know, sometimes I bring a beautiful naivety to these things. Ruth, I noticed you've made a couple of points there, but your hand's also up.
I just think it feels like this is massively more complicated than most of us need. I think most housing associations in Wales have got a couple of extra care schemes, maybe a hostel, you know, and we're already depooling the service charges. We're charging per metre squared because we've already had to split out the communal areas from the flats because of housing benefit eligibility and non-housing
Mhm.
benefit eligibility. So we've already done that work. We've got that, we already feel like it's fair pricing. We're basing it based on the bills that we pay. We already do shopping around for good deals for our residents because we're trying to keep rents and service charges affordable per the Welsh Government requirements of us, and the service charges are already regulated by the Leasehold Valuation Tribunal. So it feels more complicated than we need. I'm still trying to struggle with what's in scope. Do we have to do it or not? For example, we've got HMOs. A lot of us have got HMOs, housing multiple occupation.
HMOs are outside of scope.
Yeah, so we've got hostels, which we let per room. So we're assuming those are kind of like a HMO.
So if there's
Yeah.
shared facilities like kitchens and bathrooms, they are outside of scope.
Right. So in which case, most of us, all we've probably got is a few blocks of flats, extra care schemes, probably most of them.
I mean, the principle, and I totally get it, right? And we have come across plenty of HAs with like one or two.
Yeah.
And but from Ofgem's and the government's point of view, there is no less a reason why those customers shouldn't be protected compared to somebody living in a great big, 25,000 people.
Yeah.
The difference with us in the social housing sector is, of course, they are already protected because they are social housing customers, right? They you look after them already. So, and there has been this tension between what they're trying to introduce with these heat network regulations, with the current housing regulation, that there has been a tension since the Competition Market Authority did their first thing like 5 or 6 years ago, so, and we've been banging the drum that this has to work together. And as we're getting close, we're just seeing it all crunching together more and more as everyone realizes how tight this all is, and like emerged last time, and has already been raised today, I don't even think they necessarily realize that the housing legislation is different in Wales. So there's this other layer that they're still not seeing. So, and that is why it is really important that we get these definitions for the segmentation about not-for-profits and small, because small might mean your organizational annual turnover is a low amount, or it might mean your total amount of housing is a small amount, or it might mean your number of heat networks is a small amount. So you might be an enormous housing association with only one block of flats, or you might have 2,000 homes and they're all communal heating. They're all for older people, so they're all these sort of small blocks of sheltered. Or you might be somewhere in the middle. And I know in England that HAs with fewer than 1,000 homes have lighter reporting requirements. And we are kind of working on the assumption that it'll be something similar here, but we just don't know. And that's why we need, the government's response to the earlier consultations to come out and more information on the data portal. But at the moment it's all in, apart from HMOs.
I think it's sorry, Ruth. I think it's difficult for the sector, but I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of this hard work has been done by the sector. What I think we're going to have to demonstrate is how do we show that we can deliver fair and proportionate, to end consumers. And I think absolutely we can, but the difficulty is that, trying to get the sector to put that information together and all of that. And I think we need to make an argument that you can get to fair and proportionate with a much simpler approach than the one you've taken. Basically, they've tried to go, right, okay, you need to take this into account and this into account and this into account. And ultimately we need to come up with something that is simpler at the very beginning, much simpler, so that they can then build this over time. Trying to impose this massively complex system on a world where they don't know, how schemes operate is going to be really, really difficult. And unfortunately, I think the only people that are going to pay the price for that is the sector. Sorry, Ruth, you were just about to say something, I think.
No, it's just that, at the moment, what we're scrabbling about with, so say, for example, the extra care schemes are in scope, they do end up being in scope. We don't know whether, if individual metering is going to be enforced, we don't know whether to put budget aside for the investment in putting the infrastructure in place in order to do that at the moment, because there's still a question as to whether they may be exempt in the future. Older persons, there's been talk about that.
I think on the metering, I think we'll get clarification on the metering very soon, and I wouldn't I would not be surprised if extra care is excluded from metering. I
Right.
think that would be a good thing. But metering, whereas metering was all of the regs, now metering is 5%, right?
Right.
So they will not be excluded from all of the other stuff that we talked about
No.
before, like
Fair charging,
complaints
etc.
policies, fair
Yeah.
charging, you know,
And
going to appointments
non-evictable.
when you said you will, or all
Yeah.
of that stuff.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
metering is almost, I know you need the budget and everything, you need
I know.
certainty on that. And I
Yeah.
think that this is why we're waiting for the technical standards consultation, because
Yeah.
we think a lot of that is going to be packed into there.
Yeah.
And even if they are excluded from metering, they're included in everything else.
But I think most of us have got fair pricing structures in place. We've already got, complaints policies and procedures in place. We're already under another ombudsman for that. And my comment about the non-evictable, because it's depooled, because they're separate charges, it's no problem for us to make that a separate sub-account non-evictable service charge. We've actually already got that for water charges in our association. So that's just a minor technicality. That's not investing large sums of money to put in metering infrastructure in. I think it's the metering that worries me more than any of the arrests and stuff. We can already answer that.
And I think the technical standards will worry you once you see them as well.
Okay.
Just so you know.
All right, thanks.
Nick?
You can just keep the question and answer it later. So I commented back to Ruth about maybe why I'm getting exercised about it. We got over 50 heat networks. We think at least 2 or 3 of which are DNs, which is exciting. I wondered if we've got, and you can answer this later, whether we've got a position on mixed communal networks where there's end users that have got shared base communities and those that haven't. Specifically, we manage, run, own some student accommodation, and instantly go, shared amenities, completely excluded. But the design of it is such that there are what most of us recognize as, like, rooms with a shared kitchen and toilets and showers. But there's also individual flats for families, for like mature students who don't use any of the shared amenities and don't have access to it, but they're on it. And if we haven't, the answer might be no. But one of the things I've suggested to Beth, and CHC goes back with the question, but maybe Rachel, Nicholas, this is something you can take forward, is will there be a way of determining the answer on that? Will it be about the number of customers as to whether it is a relevant heat network? Because clearly then we need, sorry to, without sort of going on, if it's a simple thing of, well, if there's any end user without a shared basic amenity, it becomes a relevant heat network. That brings with it a whole unpacking of, well, what do you do with all of those students in rooms and how do you manage that? If there's a test of proportionate or whatever, we need to understand that, because it'd be very easy to ignore it, but I can see a world where they go, aha. I know they're saying they want to be fair and reasonable, but I think there's going to be a lot of ahas coming in this as they find complexity. So I just wondered if we got a view on that.
I personally don't have a view. I don't know if Nicholas does. I think that the only thing to compare it to at the moment is in the metering and billing regs, when we were doing cost effectiveness tests for metering, and you had sort of mixed blocks where some of the accommodation was sheltered and some of it was general needs. They said even if one property is sheltered, then you can count it all as sheltered and therefore put it in the excluded box for meter installs. Under the metering and billing regs, this might change. So they were like, I don't know if they would. I have no idea. I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's a very good point, and I think it reflects on the fact that Ofgem just they do not understand how many different connotations and mutations there are of all the different sorts of ways in which these things can be, heat networks can be put together.
Yeah, my thoughts is that, as part of this engagement and that last point that Rachel was making, it's going to be the classic 80-20 here, isn't it? 80% of schemes are going to be fairly straightforward if we're talking about general needs in a heat network, a block of flats, but there's going to be 20% that are really messy, really difficult, not sure. And I think that's one of the things that, we do need to get across and say, look, we're not trying to be difficult. We're not trying to make this obscure but there are schemes that we just don't know, and nobody wants to end up resolving those through citizens advised, energy ombudsman, and the courts and all of those. Dear Ofgem, we are committed to this. We want to do this, and we will tell you that all of our general needs schemes, or the simple, straightforward, we will we will be able to apply whatever we end up with the principles and and we will do this because we are a regulated body, and we're grown ups and all of those things. But we also want the 20% that aren't clear, unsure. Can we just put those in the bucket of, right, we will resolve this once we're up and running with regulation, because there's going to be a whole load of stuff under the new regulations. This is one small bit of it, and we want to work to solutions on that 20%, but that's just going to take some time to work through. That will be a great outcome in my view for the sector, is to go, we are committed, we want to work this through, let's commit to that 80%. We'll work out with you on the 20% that we just can't come up with the answer for at this point.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Tea and Bicky time.
And we'll have a quick break. Yeah, just sort of 5-6 minutes, if that about. We'll start back at 1:45, if that's okay. So just a very quick comfort break, and then we'll crack on. if a couple of people could wave at us when you're back, if Bethan, if you're here, or Nick or Ruth, anyone we've been talking to, great.
Yeah, I'm here.
I'm here.
Fab. Great. Okay. Well, we'll assume we've got folk, and we'll keep moving on. So that was the sort of fair pricing principles. We're now going to cover everything else. So the fair pricing principles takes up about half, a third to a half of the consultation. And then there's these other bits, the first of which is cost allocation. So cost allocation, basically they say that the market is too complicated to set out prescriptive rules about pricing structures. So they are not going to tell you how to set your tariff because there are so many different ways that people do it because they've got to compare you guys and enormous sort of commercial for-profit heat district schemes and hospitals and university campuses and very, very tiny tenant management organizations and those sorts of things, such a range with all different commercial models and structures. So they're not going to tell you how to set a tariff, although they do expect most of them would have a standing charge and a variable rate. They've kind of said they expect that is how most of them will probably work, but there isn't going to be rules about what you can put in and out of different parts of your tariff. Initially, they are only going to have one prescriptive rule, and that is this in bold, and that's GSOP payments, which are guaranteed standards of performance. So they're compensation payments, basically, if you miss KPIs on how you run your heat networks. So any compensation payments, fines, penalties, or any other redress provided to consumers should not be passed. Sorry, any redress provided should not be passed through to the consumer. So if you have to pay a fine, you cannot pass that fine through to your customers. And that is going to be the one and only prescriptive rule at the moment. This does raise quite a lot of questions for the social housing sector. Basically what we were talking about earlier about cross subsidization. So if you where are you going to get that money from if it isn't taken from the rent money? In some way somebody is a customer is paying for it in some way. Anyway, there will be guidance issues around cost allocation. There's going to be lots of guidance, as I've said already, across the summer. And as well as tariffs likely having standard and variable charges, they're also going to say, I think I mentioned this before as well, but there would need to be some sort of, they would recommend, or it would be good practice to have some sort of consumption proxy for unmetered schemes. So like the number of bedrooms or the square meterage of the dwelling, which many of you already have for your service charges. They talk again about an equitable distribution of upfront capital costs over time. That's the temporal mismatch. So what happens if you build a new scheme, the customers who move in early end up paying more because a lot of the flats are empty, it costs more money for the people who do live there compared to the people who move in later. So they want to make sure that is avoided. And they are also you will also have to put in place billing guidance to explain how your charges are set. And this is quite an important thing. And I think it's one of the things you can get started with straight away. So it will have to be a document that is available to customers, particularly when they query their tariff or make a complaint. But I think it would be good practice just to have it in the public domain all the time about this is how we set our tariffs, and this is what's in them, and this is how often we change them, and it doesn't have to be very long and it has to be very accessible and all those things, but you will have to have this piece of this written billing guidance. So that's a thing. Some more. I've duplicated myself. This is the same thing again here. Sorry, not very good slides. So in the best practice guidance, cost reflectivity, which mentioned, this is basically what I've already said. A bit more of a note there on the billing guidance. So it clearly explains how the charges are set, and it could include illustrative examples. So for example, if you live in this size flat, 1-bedroom flats can expect to spend this much money. Those are the sorts of best practice things that are going to come out. There will be a new authorised authorization condition. So this is for the first time in the current consultation. All the other authorization conditions we've seen so far were in the consumer protection consultation. And this basically just codifies what we've just said. Firstly, that you must ensure that you meet the cost allocation guidance to make sure things are fair. And secondly, that you can't pass through any compensation or fines to your customers. So you couldn't put your tariffs up to reflect that. You couldn't have one-off costs. It's sort of, this works really well if you're for profit. So if they're thinking of fining British Gas or E.ON or anybody else, Octopus, they have a profit pot, and if they pay a fine, it comes out of the profit. But how do not-for-profit organisations pay a fine without, in some way, passing it through to customers? Anyway, the authorisation condition is in the consultation. And then again, just for reference, there's some questions about, do you agree there should be this prescriptive rule about not passing through compensation? Do you agree with the things that should be in the guidance, etc.? And then I'm just also going to go at fairly high level through the other sections as well. I felt that these were too detailed in the consultation to do in a lot of detail here. So at a high level, it all goes into the economics and the statistical relevance of different models. But there's 4 things. The first one is benchmarking. And as you can probably tell, in order to do this fair and proportionate pricing, they're going to have to do benchmarking across the market because they're not going to have these defined rules. This is what is proposed. We might be able to change their minds on this. So the first thing they need to work out is, what are they going to benchmark? Because some people have standing charges, some people will have variable charges. If you're not metered, you won't have either of those things, and how are you going to compare all these different things, And the answer is they're going to look at the total effective price faced by consumers. So it's going to be how much customers pay. It's not how much is your standing charge or how much is your variable charge. It is what do customers pay for the heat at your heat network, probably annually. And then it is likely they have proposed 3 different models for benchmarking. Some of them are easier to, and there's like pages on this. The first benchmark is to compare it with how much it would be to have a gas boiler or to have a heat pump. So that's called external benchmarking. So it costs this much to have heat from this heat network, or you would be paying this much if you had a gas boiler and this much if you had a heat pump. That's type 1. Benchmark 2 is to compare them against your own past prices. So last year my customers were paying this much for the heat on this heat network. This year they are paying this much for their heat on my heat network. And so it's comparing it with your own prices. And there's pros and cons of all of these things. One of the cons about comparing it to your own past prices is, if your previous prices were very, very high, it will only tell if it's changed. It won't say if your original pricing was disproportionate in the first place. So that's why they're going to need lots of different models and sort of triangulate them. And I think as well, they will actually roll forward with all of them, and one of them might fall by the wayside, as in 5 years' time, they might go, this one isn't actually showing us anything new. And I think these will develop over time. And then the third one is comparator benchmarks, which is basically comparing your prices with prices in the wider market, in the heat network market. One of these models, and this is massively summarized here, as I say, there's pages on this. One of them is comparing it to a segment, so like a bucket of similar heat networks to yours. So, if you've got a heat network that was built before 2014, and it's 50 units and it's not metered and it's not for profit, all that segmentation matrix that will come up with a bucket of heat networks, and you will be compared to other heat networks in the same bucket. Big problem with that is deciding what the buckets are in order to do those comparisons and that benchmarking. And then the other comparator benchmark compares it against across the whole of the market. And there's pros and cons about that as well, because some we will likely be charging our customers less than Eon, for example, for lots of different reasons. So, that there's pros and cons of that as well. But it's still interesting to know the disparity of pricing between the commercial district heating schemes and the ones we run ourselves, because of course some of our customers will be living on those schemes if we are the section, if we're the social housing provider, the affordable housing provider on some of those schemes. So that's what they're going to be doing on benchmarking. And of course, this is critical for them because otherwise that's how they're going to work out if something is fair and proportionate, by triangulating these three different models. The second other thing is profitability analysis. And this, as it says, is to help determine whether prices are earning excess profits, but they are not going to apply this to the not-for-profit sector. So if you are for profit, and remember, we haven't yet got a definition of profit and not-for-profit, but let's assume it's not us. But if you are for profit, they will collect up more financial information for you, so they can do basically earnings before tax, EBIT, and they will do some financial calculations and work out if you're making too much profit, really, and taking advantage of the fact that it is a monopoly market. And if you are an outlier in that sort of profitability analysis, they will then do a more detailed and more resource intensive and expensive way of doing the same sort of financial modeling based on return of capital investment. And then that could trigger a price investigation. As I've said, it's not for profit. We don't know what that definition is. We also don't know if they will also want to collect up some of that financial information from us anyway. And I don't know if that information will be at a heat network level, which would be very difficult for us to do, or an organizational level. So, more information required. But broadly, we will, I think, be outside of that piece of work. Number 3 is central price transparency, and this is if and how price information can be clearly presented and easily accessible to the public. So this isn't information about, my tariff letter. This is your tariff. You're paying, 50 pence standing charge and 20 pence kilowatt hour. Not that. This is comparing it so they can find out how their prices compare to other people on heat networks. There is already something a bit similar to this, the Heat Trust, which was sort of the voluntary precursor to a lot of the consumer protection stuff. They have a heat network calculator, a cost calculator on their website. You can put in your costs and it does a bit of a comparison to how much you'd be paying if you were on gas. So it kind of starts to give you an indication of where you are. So it's a bit like a public facing benchmarking type thing. And although people can't switch, because that's why you would normally want a price comparison to find out if somebody's paying less money, and then you would switch in the gas or electricity markets. The idea is that if you had a better understanding, you would be more empowered to challenge your bills, and they're hoping that will keep heat network operators keen and keep their prices reasonable. Again, there's different methods of doing this price transparency, different ways of segmenting the market. Could customers choose their own segments? Do they understand enough information? Pros and cons of RAG rating, giving sort of traffic lights. What does red actually mean? Would that set the hairs running? Would people be very alarmed if they had a red, and would that need a lot more guidance? So there's loads of discussion around this. Broadly thinking, I think as a sector, we probably think it is good that customers can see this. It wouldn't be, I don't think they're talking about having a league table, so it wouldn't be like a name and shame type thing, but they'd be able to see buckets of comparison and keep everybody honest in a way. So there's plenty in there as well. And as I said last week, I did a 2-hour webinar just about this that Ofgem presented, and it was quite complicated. And then the final one is price investigations. So if any of these things, if the benchmarking or the profitability analysis, if they find the outliers, and it could trigger further investigation and then further research because they're doing things on a case-by-case basis. There'd be further information gathering, and then it could possibly trigger a price investigation, which can include fines. There's a short list of things that they have powers to do, but that won't come in until January 27, because they know that they need at least a year. We think probably longer, but they think they need at least a year to gather information in order to have enough benchmarking information to tell if prices are out of whack. And then again, for your information, when you get the slide deck, these are the consultation questions. So these are the ones on benchmarking, the ones on profitability analysis, there's ones on price transparency, as well. Which order should they be brought in? Because some can be brought in sooner because they need less data to introduce them and things like that. And then one about investigations. So I'm going to pause again there. Any other questions? So Nick, you got one there about GSOPs you want to chat us through?
I just wondered whether there'd been a change in the approach for GSOPs for NFPs, not for profits, NPFs, whatever they are, NFPs.
Yeah.
Because I'd seen in the consumer protection consultation from November last year that they were proposing not for profit GSOP
Wouldn't have to pay them.
They would follow, maybe wouldn't have to pay them, but they would
Mm.
maybe follow the approach that, say, we've got in Wales and I guess in England as well, as social housing, where we have to provide an improvement plan to the regulator if we're found to be lacking. When you said when it was in your slides, I thought, do you know something more than us? And
Right.
they're now thinking that maybe we do have to. And I guess not written in my question there is what happens if you're both? Back to my thing of mixed networks as we start to roll them out. At what point? But that's maybe not one for everyone on the call. So yeah, just a clarity there on that.
This along with unbundling of service charges is one of the areas we really need to wait for the government response to the consultation to come out. I think it was one of the areas that was unclear. My feeling, and Nicholas might have a different view, my feeling is that I think they are going to put it back in. I think they are going to say that social housing providers will have to pay some level of compensation, maybe not the level that they had in the consultation. And I think the rationale for that is you already pay compensation to other customers for missing KPIs, possibly. So this isn't GSOP's particular about service standards. So it's how quickly do you reconnect heating after an outage, or do you meet all of your appointments and things like that. So that's my understanding, is there is already compensation for things similar to that, and within your own customer base, some people will be getting compensation for things like if they had a gas boiler, they might be getting compensation for missed appointments, but if they were on a heat network, they weren't. Doesn't sound like that's the case where you are.
Well, the look on my face. So, I mean, I've worked in a number of organisations, but there's probably loads of people much more expert on the call than me. I've seen it where if we've used an external contractor, we've said, well, if you miss an appointment as an external contractor, we will require you to make a payment to the tenant for something like a gas boiler service. And rather than paying compensation, we might pay them, say, additional cost for running like fan heaters and some sort of temporary hot water provision from an electricity supply if we couldn't fix their gas boiler. But again, we'd pass that back through to the contractor, or we'd cover it if it was our issue. So we've had a situation where a heat network was off and we were making goodwill payments, recognizing the customers were in detriment. But specifically saying we didn't fix your boiler for a week, so you now get X amount of compensation, is covered under the Renting Homes Wales Act, because we've left a property, if we haven't made appropriate temporary provision, which is what we'd always do, we'd say, well, your boiler doesn't work, so here, have some fan heaters while we fix this widget that we can't get. And if we don't do that, then we potentially can have rent recovered from us. They don't have to pay their rent. So to then make us under on a heat network, they could make a claim under. I can see a scenario if they just throw them back in, and this is maybe one others want to jump in on, or we want to talk about and make representation on. could there not be a situation develop where they could claim a GSOP payment and they could seek redress under Renting Homes Wales because we've technically left a home unfit for human habitation because it didn't have heating because the heat network was off. So we'd be paying those customers twice,
I
whereas
mean,
somebody with a normal gas boiler
I
would
think
only
there's a
get
couple
one.
of things. Firstly, I don't think the policy intent is that you would pay twice, but that means that the housing and energy regulators have to make sure that that doesn't happen. I also think, about passing it through to contractors. I think this is absolutely what this is all about as well. It'll be stuff that gets passed through to contractors, and in the end, they will put it on your cost of your contract, which in effect will mean it gets passed through to your customers. So it is a complicated thing. And the other thing about under the Renting in Wales Act, about being able to withhold rent, I don't think that's a thing in England, and therefore it is one of those things that I don't think the policymakers in London understand that is different in Wales. So it's another thing we need to make very clear. Nicholas, I bet you've got thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think they're going to put it back in for not-for-profits. Two reasons. First of all, there was a very strong reaction from consumer advocacy bodies that this wasn't fair. That consumers, regardless of where they lived, should get the same compensation or have access to the same compensation. It was a very strong reaction. And the second was that many housing providers said, well, we already pay compensation for other things, so this would be an anomaly if we didn't pay compensation on this. I think the broad, we'll have to wait and see what the final consultation says, but I think the broad sense in the sector, you tell us otherwise, was that compensation is fine as long as we can set what those levels are, because you need to have an approach that was across your portfolio, that you had justified and put together, that those levels of compensation were not imposed from the outside, because there was always the heat trust compensation levels, which are higher than what most people are currently paying. So I think that's broadly the position. We will see what the final consultation says, but I think not-for-profits are back in terms of compensation payments for residents, but we need to argue that it's up to housing providers to set what those levels of compensation are. Your point, Nick, about double payments, yeah, I think they do need to sort it out as to how that will potentially operate. And Rachel's point about they have no visibility whatsoever on the different setup in Wales at all.
And I think, Beth, and this is maybe, sorry, just like an action, this is something we need to get on top of, just as we think this might be happening. Only because I can just see this scenario where the Renting Homes Wales is Welsh Government legislation, not governed by UK.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know the interplay and all the constitutional arrangements well enough, but the fact that Westminster or Whitehall or whatever say we don't want double charging doesn't mean that a tenant can't make a claim under a piece of legislation that applies in Wales only.
Correct.
Right? So
Yeah.
either Welsh Government need to change the Renting Homes Wales Act or UK government need to move. And quite frankly, they don't actually talk to each other very well anyway. And
Yeah.
I don't want a tenant to be put, I personally, but also I wouldn't thought any organisation wants a tenant to be at detriment. But we're going to put loads of tenants at detriment if you get some clever clogs ones identifying there's a route here for double compensation. And we'd obviously always want to avoid a scenario where it happens. Don't get me wrong, but it just feels like it's just bum backwards. I was going to say something else, but I'm conscious we're being recorded. If they're really not thinking about the interplay here, and I just go return to Renting Homes Wales is Welsh legislation and Welsh government, so UK government can't just stamp on it.
And dare I suggest that an enterprising legal firm would easily identify where heat networks were and were leafleting people for a whole range of GSOP issues. It's an easy one to identify, isn't it? Disrepair is quite difficult to identify, but actually blocks of flats, pretty much guaranteed in certain circumstances for them to be on a heat network. So yeah, it is really important to thrash this out.
And does compensation mean financial? Does it mean a check or something folding with the king's head on it? Or is it simply enough to say your heat network went down and within 4 hours everybody had alternative means of heat? If that wasn't by a
that
temporary
would mean that
hookup,
compensation wouldn't, you would be within your service. You had provided them with heat within 4 hours, that would be fine. It's only if you didn't do that. But but
okay.
but then it would be financial. That is my understanding. I'm just going to quickly go on to your second point here,
Yeah.
before we move on a bit, is about comparing metered and non-metered schemes on the benchmarking. I think they will be segmented. I think they will look at them separately. I don't think they will compare metered and unmetered, the cost that customer pay on metered and unmetered schemes. I think they will be looked at separately. And then Liz has just put one in terms of profit covering of costs which relate to sinking fund for non-profit, then could you use the pot for any compensation? So use the sinking fund pot, I think. This would have to decide if this is in line with the values and also in line with the Renting Homes Act. Yeah, I don't know. I think the whole area about this, what's counted as cost cross subsidization, and where are you going to get this money from? It's a big point. Right, I think we should move on, Nicholas, to thinking about what all this means.
Okay. Do I have to start talking now? I was getting quite used to you doing all this.
I'm done now.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, this is really just to start shaping, what all of this means, because there is a lot of detail, which we do need to understand. But then it's trying to, zoom back up a little bit so that can be, used as the basis of a response. By CHC, but also more broadly for individual housing associations as well, because there is an issue of making sure that as many people respond as possible, even if it's just an outline letter. So these were some reflections that we've had following other discussions with housing providers as well as our own, of course. So next slide, please, Rach. Okay. So, not surprisingly, and I think this was Ruth's point, we now have multiple elements that we're trying to balance here, some of which are crunching into each other. So, broad principle, fair and proportionate, right? Can't argue with that. Cost reflective. I would suggest that most housing providers are not necessarily doing cost reflective charging on their heat networks, or at least don't have the data to say whether they are doing cost reflective. Then of course that crunches into what you can charge in tariffs and what needs to go into rent because of the various housing acts, for example. They're suggesting that you can include investment costs in that as well. So which of those costs and how do we identify what those are? Billing costs, of course, that's relatively straightforward. I think there's a question around, and I cannot say this word, I've tried it in a number of sessions, interoperability, nearly getting there. And reliability of meters. We know from what our clients tell us is that there is an issue of reliability of meter data, which then has a massive impact on the tariffs that you charge because you're not getting the information in order to understand what the efficiency of that heat network is, for example. And then that ability to switch metering and billing providers when you do have individual meters, it's still an issue in the sector, regardless of what people say. Some are easier to swap than others, and some are not possible to swap at all, it appears. Our acid test for that is how many metering and billing providers use a particular meter. And we often find that lots cannot use a particular meter. So that's a real challenge. Currently, the specification for meters is looking like it's coming under HENTAS as well. but there is zero representation of the social housing sector or even heat network operators, as far as I know, on that as well. It's likely to be a specification that's written by metering and billing providers. Efficiency, we all know efficiency is an issue because of the way that schemes have been designed and developed. In the UK, we see on average a 40% efficiency. We've seen as low as less than 10%. 20% is not unusual. We're no longer surprised by that level. We don't have an agreed way of assessing efficiency on heat networks. We always say it's the whole scheme, so plant, laterals, risers, HIUs, everything is in there, but we know others have just said plant room efficiency. So we need to get to the bottom of that again, because it makes such a difference to the tariff that's being charged. And we also know it's the number one challenge that leaseholders and tenants have about any tariff that's being set. I understand your gas input costs, I understand the metering and billing costs, but why am I being charged this tariff because your heat network is only 20% efficient? And that makes a big difference. You can charge for the services, but what services and how does that fit with various housing acts? Again, fuel costs. This is an issue around procurement timeframes and how long you can procure for. So the whole issue of engaging and advising tenants and leaseholders that you are procuring. There is an inbuilt tendency to have shorter contracts of a year for procurement rather than the longer term ones, because of the difficulty of engaging with leaseholders and tenants around that. But at the other side, Ofgem and others in the energy industry think that you should have much longer contracts in place. Again, they're buying commodities. It's a very, very different world to the one that we've got. Profit, again, that all comes down to that definition of, where is not for profit? Is it not for profit scheme? Is it not for profit organization? How do you deal with, schemes that are a mixture of those? So some reflections on that complexity that Rachel had been through. The introduction of cost reflectivity and profit, again, that subject, could increase prices for consumers. I think that's a reality that I don't think people are recognizing, that a lot of heat networks are losing money. Again, I think we probably raised it in the previous session, but we see portfolios losing hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions on their heat networks because they haven't changed the tariffs. A lot didn't increase their prices during COVID, for example, as part of that, and never changed them as a result. So if they do then increase their prices to reflect the costs, the actual costs that they've got, which they should do according to the principles, consumers' prices are going to go up. Communicating that level of complexity on the right-hand side is going to be really difficult. It's hard enough as it is trying to explain to residents, right, this is your service charge or tariff. It's built up of these particular elements, which currently is only, at the most half a dozen elements. Well, all of a sudden, there's going to be a lot of other elements in there that you're building that up. And that's going to be a tricky one to explain to residents in any meaningful way. There's no point, communicating with customers if it doesn't make sense, right? It will be a key target for challenge. It already was. It was probably the number one issue that we saw with the sector was cost. It's the engagement that consumers have with their landlord on their heat networks. Many consumers don't know they're on a heat network. In some senses, that's great because they're not thinking about it. And if they're not thinking about it, that's because it does what it should do, which is provide heat and hot water at a reasonable cost, right? But when they get that tariff change or that bill or whatever it is, that's when they start to go, oh, hang on a minute, this is reasonable or unreasonable. And of course, we saw a massive change with the energy crisis that we had, and then the introduction of the energy billing discount scheme. And, you know, let's just say it was challenging around how that was done and administered, for example. And now we have consumer advice as the regulatory consumer advocate and the energy ombudsman. So we're likely to see a significant increase in the number of those challenges that housing providers get. I guess my thoughts are is that this is now so complex that it runs the risk of never being right. So you might be right on cost reflectivity, but then is that right in terms of the benchmarking? And benchmarking for me is going to be really problematic and really difficult, and something that, you know, is going to take years for it to be really meaningful. Yes, you could probably compare it to gas and electric heating, you know, in a really crude way, but then it doesn't reflect the other principles that are in there. So you know, is this all principles are equal, just some are more equal than others? And you know, this feels like a recipe for, you know, challenge by, you know, the statutory bodies, but also, you know, lawyers as well. You know, the more complex the way it's built up, the more opportunities there are to pick holes in it. And you know, that's not ultimately going to be good for the end consumer, you know, because that's just going to end up in lots of time and energy spent on challenges around, you know, increasingly detailed issues. And the problem is that those challenges, even if you end up in court, you know, as a way of starting to work out the definition of fair and proportionate, the difficulty is that that's really difficult to apply in any universal way, because heat networks are so scheme and provider specific. Go back to that previous point. This is not a commodity. We don't buy heat off somebody, and we don't, which we then sell to somebody else, like they do gas and electricity. You put your markup on your, you know, on top of that. This is way more complicated than that. So it could be that never-ending round of challenges, citizen advice, energy ombudsman, the courts, you know, so everybody's trying to work out what actually fair means in all of this. Piece in italics at the bottom, there is no evidence and base on which to create an effective pricing mechanism. In fact, we have no evidence base. You know, it just simply does not exist. We have lots of information on, you know, the prices that housing associations are charging through the tariffs, etc. But it's, you know, again, we only work with 100+, you know, housing providers. There's a lot more out there who will do things very differently, for example. So I think that's for me, one of the key messages is you can't make policy, you know, the often iterated, you know, this has to be evidence-based policy, right? Well, there is zero evidence at the moment for this. That's not to say that we don't want to get to that end goal, fair, proportionate, but that needs to be built on that evidence base. So next slide. These slides are making me even more ranty than I normally am. I do apologize. Okay, so I would suggest, and that's why I'm saying these are serving suggestions. Ofgem needs at least 2, maybe even 5 years worth of data gathering on pricing. Otherwise, they're trying to assess fair and a cost basis without knowing what actually that means. 2 years is really tight. That's only 2 winters. It's not really going to give you that, you know, consistency to understand why different prices are different in different circumstances. And let's be honest, this is going to be a huge amount of data that's going to be generated, and all the variables that are in that data are going to be massive. You know, you can, on one level, would be dead simple, isn't it? How much is an individual being charged for this? Well, how much are they being charged if they're a 1-bed flat, 2-bed flat, 3-bedroom house? How old is the scheme system? What metering and billing provider have got? What is the efficiency of the heat network? What technology have they got in the plant room? You know, there is just so many bits to how that price is actually made up, and they are all variables that potentially interplay with each other as well. Need to understand what the impacts of price reflectivity and investment will be, given that in the majority of cases, schemes are not charging full costs, and the impact of, I've put a Landlord and Tenant Act there, let's say Housing Act. And I've put no one. I was challenged in a session the other day by a housing provider that no one is putting aside sinking funds, and they were. So I put my hand up that some people are doing this. My experience generally is the sector does a just-in-time investment model, if we can say that, is that they don't generally put money away for big costs down the road. They will deal with those when they come up, and it all kind of smushes out over time. Well, the pricing consultation is going to challenge the sector to start doing that. What can we put in that sinking fund? How is that charged for? For example, there isn't currently a mechanism for most housing providers. Again, I'm happy to be challenged on this, and if the majority are doing that, then at least we have something to play with. What I would add to that is that most housing providers are not aware of their heat networks, the age of their heat networks. We've seen a boom in the growth of heat networks in the last 10 to 15 years. Well, a lot of those heat networks are coming to the end of their useful life. And that's not even the ones that were before that. So most don't know that they are there. They don't know what kit they've got in the plant room. They don't know the state of the laterals and risers, and the pumps and the valves and all of those things. So there is no recognition, visibility of the costs that are in there. So even if there is a sinking fund, what's that sinking fund based on, etc., etc. So after the above is completed, to create key price bands based on size, age, and efficiency. And I'm talking very, very broad. So building that data to fill those buckets. At the moment, develop segmentation, profit, not for profit. We've touched on that a number of times today. The difficulty of coming up with that definition. Supported housing, extra care versus general needs. I hadn't thought of that kind of 80-20 thing before. I raised it earlier, but I think there is a strong argument for there being unforeseen consequences for particularly vulnerable groups here. Is that by driving fair and proportionate pricing and individual metering to particular groups, you're not serving the end consumer, because you're not doing based on the evidence for that, and trying to communicate a really complicated tariff or service charge to an end consumer who has other vulnerabilities, I don't think serves them particularly well. Doesn't mean you don't want to do that in the longer term, but let's work it out on the easy stuff first. So I think this would then create a more reasonable and effective definition of fair that consumers would understand and landlords could work towards. And in the meantime, and this has come up again and again with conversations with Ofgem and DESNZ, is that the sector commits to work to its best endeavours. We're not rapacious, profit making, trying to make this as difficult and be as play hardball with this. The sector understands the point of regulation and consumer protection, and that the sector wants to work towards those main principles, whilst the data and definitions of fair and proportionate are developed. So ongoing engagement and development with operators, housing providers, and Ofgem during this period. I think we have to recognise the politics of this situation as well. Is that clearly Ofgem have been given this job, and they're under fairly significant pressure because of some of the issues that came up in the retail gas and electricity markets, and they want to make sure this goes right. And if you're under pressure, I'm not suggesting they're massively gold plating this. I generally think their approach on consumer protection has been reasonable, given what information that they've got. But if you think something's going to go wrong, what do? You chuck more stuff at it to make sure it's going to be okay. And this pricing bit feels a little bit like that. Let's add this. Let's put that in. Right? Okay. In a perfect world, we should add that to it. So I think we need to be, sitting around the virtual table with Ofgem and working through, a lot of those issues so that it works for consumers ultimately, because the sector wants to get to the same place that Ofgem does. It's just how we get there, I think, is the argument. It's all about that kind of, we're asking this, more time, or changes to it. What's our give? Well, we will commit to the end goal, and we will also make sure that we're putting in place the things now to do as much as we possibly can, which is kind of the next bit, really. Right, I think we're on to just maybe some questions before we do that next bit.
Yeah, I don't know if people have got thoughts and reflections on what Nicholas was just saying there, and really we're getting to the part we do have another survey to sort of collect in your thoughts about the response to Ofgem in this consultation. But generally, if people got thoughts about some things have come up, but one very strong message is that we need to make sure that the Westminster government is very aware of where Welsh regulation is different. I think that is a very strong point that needs to come forward, not only in this consultation response, but generally. And I know that Bethan works closely with Ian. We've met him as well as the regulator, and that there is stuff to be done there, I think. Nick?
Really simple. I think we need to make it clear as a sector, via all means, that we are not in the business of disproportionately charging our customers deliberately or for other gain. We're not in the business of evicting people because they don't pay their rent. We're not in the business of not protecting vulnerable people. It's the counterfactual. We're actually in the business of doing everything we can to sustain tenancies, to keep people in homes, to house people that are vulnerable, to charge them fair prices. How we get that across, I don't know. But I think, so what you said, Nicholas, about we want to work towards that end goal. It's not just we need to make sure we don't just have it as a passive line. Yeah, we want to do that, because it's easy to say that. I think they get it, but I think Ofgem really need to understand the nature of the housing sector, and the housing sector in Wales, certainly. I mean, I can only speak for my organisation, but yeah, all sorts of complexities, commercial thinking, blah, blah, blah. But we're in the business of housing vulnerable people, not evicting them and putting them on the street and trying to make a profit. So why wouldn't we be aligned with this regulation? And I challenge the view that we should be asking for exemption from the regulation on that basis. What we want is appropriate implementation of it in our sector, not an exemption from it, if that makes sense. But it's that message we need to get across. Obviously, others may have different views, but yeah.
Anyone else got thoughts? Bethan, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I am here.
Have you got thoughts generally or specifically?
I was just pondering on Nick's comments there. I think the consultation is certainly one avenue that we can do that. Probably need to have a think about how else we can do that. I think as well, just got reflections on your points around the differences between Wales and England. I think we really need to keep Ian Walters, the regulator, on top of that. If I'm being completely honest, I don't think he had said himself that he wasn't aware that this was coming. So that piece just feels really important. But yeah, there's a lot to take in. It's very complicated.
Oh, there we go. Well, what I'll do while we're having a bit of a think is I'll launch the second survey. Nicholas, if you can put the link in the chat again. So this is just it gives a list of concerns and asks you to rank them. So which of these is your sort of most pressing concern, and then a bit of space for other things you think we should include in the CHC response. So we'll just pause and give you some time to do that. But if there's other things you want to just unmute and ask us about, then please do so.
So on the first question, you can shuffle things up and down. Yeah. I assume the box that says, do you have other concerns, is not text limited, Rach?
No, hopefully not. I think I allowed for a long answer.
Okay.
Nick.
Just a thought that occurred to me while I was watching what was popping up on the screen. I haven't been through the full consultation yet, but I assume that fancy 2-hour webinar the other day about communicating with customers is part of the consultation. And I wonder whether we need to take some time to incorporate our thoughts on that as a sector, because the more I think about that discussion last week, the more concern
Were you
I've
on
got.
it?
Yeah, I was on
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
and well, you probably saw my name pop up a number of times, actually going, really? Um, what I where I saw a real risk and problem was we're going to see more complaints, or we're going to spend more time dealing with explaining things to customers, because what is allegedly published as transparency is just more trees when people are looking for some wood, if you want an analogy. And I was thinking afterwards, what you kind of want is a Martin Lewis money saving expert tool for heat networks that any old person can just chuck in their heat tariff, and it can give them a kind of like rounded thing. I don't know how you get there, but maybe that's slightly off the point I wanted to make. I think we just need to really think about that, because accessibility is so key. And if it's not accessible, people are going to draw the wrong conclusions, and we in the sector are going to end up picking this up. Even if it's loads of complaints that we just can go, yeah, it's not a complaint, dealt with, and it then goes via the ombudsman, and it's almost like counterproductive, and it's going to create work for everyone. And I don't know. We need to put that forward as a sector and find a way to work with people to make that equivalent. I say Martin Lewis, or other price comparison sites that are available. But it just to make it work like that, because what my grandmother test or whatever. What does my grandmother want? She wants something simple that tells her, yeah, you might be overpriced and you need to look into it, or no, you're about right. They don't want 16 graphs with scatter plots and wavy lines.
It was nuts, wasn't it? It was so confusing.
And that's for people who can actually understand it.
Yeah.
When you then come to a lot of our tenants are vulnerable anyway, digital access is poor. You still want to offer them that protection. So I don't know, but I think we need to bring that through in the consultation.
Yeah, I think you're right.
How can we help you?
Yeah. I mean, my thought is, we're all up for transparency and want our customers to understand what's going on. But any tool that needs a guidance note, it's kind of not very accessible, is it? If you then need to read a thing to understand what the tool's telling you. Yeah, no, I agree. We do need to respond to all of the sections, but I imagine for some of them it will be a high level rather than doing each question. It will be like, this is broadly what we think about all the, on communicating with customers. Here's 2 paragraphs on what we think, rather than, do you think this benchmark, this is better than this one? It's just like, there's just general principles here. So I strongly am with you on that. Just reflect on a couple of these then before we've got a couple of, sort of what can you do right now? Oh, Liz, hello.
Hi, yeah, I attended that session last week as well. And just a quick question. I did read it, but they didn't put it in the chat. Nick was fully in charge of that. But in terms of the pricing sort of mechanisms that they were looking at, that you and Nick were just talking about, I got the impression that that was the tool that they were going to offer to consumers.
Yes.
That's right, isn't it? That's not something, so they were just going to nudge those consumers to that direction to say, there we go, that's how you can look to see whether or not the price that you're paying,
that's it,
is relatively sort of in line with others. So yeah, okay, that was my question really.
Yeah, that's right. So it's and then the point is, well, you can't do anything about it, even if you do know if you're paying a lot of money. So
yeah,
and they're going, well, it's you would then go back to your heat supplier and go, I'm paying too much, and then they would be,
and there's too many variables, isn't there? You looking at the benchmarking, I think I voted that last, because ultimately, like you said, obviously it's going to take 5 years to sort of get that potentially in place. But there are so many variables, in one of your first tables, you said, well, you might be, you might as an organization tick that box, tick that box, tick that box, tick that. Well, if that's where we are as an organization, then the pricing is going to be reflective of that anyway.
Yeah. And that's the problem in the consumer, in the customer tool. They can't just say, I'm paying £50 a week for my heat, and compare it to something else, because there are so many different things. It's not like comparing it, I'm paying this for my electric, what are you paying? It is so varied and profitable, profit, not profit, metered, not metered. So whatever it is likely that the tool will be more complicated than compare the market, compare the meerkat thing.
Oh yeah, you'd have to most probably answer 20 questions before you.
That's right. There'll all be these little slider buttons. Yes, no, yes, no, exactly. Unless you can just put in a postcode and it would know your heat network, and it would know that it was old and unmetered and things like that. Who knows?
But they would be collecting all of that information.
All those tools are available, aren't they? You can go on and you can see and you can compare. Like, I know where I am. I can go in and see what everybody else is using in my area and whether or not I'm high or I'm low. I think some of the suppliers currently do similar things like that, don't they? And I've done that in the past. But you know, when you're looking at schemes, and like you said, then you're looking at, you know, the potential age-driven systems, you know, it is, you know, what's the size of the units?
I know.
uh,
And it is that complexity. That's why, it is complicated. And how do you give a very simple, a simple
Simple answer.
explanation to customers where it is actually very difficult behind? And that's what Nicholas was saying. You know, it is, you know, just to switch back to this. Hang on.
And you know, you've got to think to yourself, especially in shelter complexes where this is you know, mainly going to apply. Admittedly, obviously, you know, Nick is with Hobble, so they have huge amounts of different types of arrangements. Then, you know, they are very keen to understand what they are paying. So I can see an increase. So I think the communication has got to go out. It's got to be very, very clear. And I agree with Nick in saying that. I think, and for Bethan as well, I think, you know, ideally what we need is a sort of sector, you know, a much wider sort of sector comms strategy around this, in terms of, because, you know, what you don't want is people moving again between different organisations and having another range of type of information that's given from one sort of housing group to another housing group. You know, you want it all to be quite aligned.
Well,
So
and that's what it's supposed to be, you know, more sort of literally more regulated and more comparable. And I mean, this table here, this is all the things that are behind the scenes. The customer, we need to explain, without going into all this detail, we need to get a simple, you know, understandable message to customers. Right, Nicholas.
Okay, right. Last bit. I'm conscious that your brains are probably very, very full at this. This last bit really is, you know, ultimately we've got to take a two-pronged approach on this. The consultation response is a really, really important one to get those views across and answer, you know, what they have framed in the fair pricing consultation, as well as the more informal responses, so that engagement with the regulator and, you know, other people in DESNZ and elsewhere as a sector. And, you know, a fair amount of that is going on in England, less so in Scotland as well. The other side of the coin is really the sector preparing for this for a couple of reasons, I guess. I think that the first one is, you know, nobody wants to be the first one to get caught, right? And you also want to be in a good position when, you know, Citizens Advice or Energy Ombudsman comes knocking on the door, because, you know, responding at that particular time takes even more energy. So it's, you know, it's also that point that Nick was making, is that, you know, this is about demonstrating that we actually do this stuff and we believe, you know, that we're protecting consumers, because we do, right? But some of the things that we will need to change slightly in order to make sure that we're doing our best endeavours to meet future regulation. That's that kind of, you know, commitment capital that we're showing to Ofgem when we are having those formal discussions, so that in 12 months' time, you know, when we're still talking to them, we can hold our hand up and say, look, we're working towards this now. We are doing things already. You know, we're not trying to avoid this. We're not trying to negotiate so that we don't have to do this. You know, we are saying to, you know, our boards and our other colleagues that we need to be working on this now, and we are doing as much as we possibly can, given that the information that we've got. So that's the purpose of this bit. I will literally, you know, boom through this one, because most of this stuff will be in the back of your mind already. Okay, so some initial actions to demonstrate best endeavours, really. Review existing service charges and tariffs as well. Check when they were last reviewed. You know, put in place a mechanism for regular reviews, whether that's 6 monthly, annually, or whatever it is. And, you know, I wouldn't overdo this, but start thinking about what that matrix of all of those issues are. You know, we've had the sinking fund issue has been raised in the chat a couple of times there. Even if it's not thought out in any detail, but just a sense of, okay, if we were to be tested today, you know, citizens advice does knock on the door, where would we look in terms of cost reflectivity, or, you know, metering and billing costs and all of those sorts of things. So a start on that, review that customer comms. You know, again, Liz, your points are absolutely well made, how difficult this is going to be to communicate. But let's do the best we can with what we've currently got. We do see a high variability in the sector in terms of the communication with customers. Some is brilliant, it's great, you know, clear, plain English, different formats, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But we also see a lot that's not good out there. And that doesn't help the cause of the sector as well. Ensure that there's a heat supply agreement in place where appropriate. Ultimately, there's going to be requirements to have a heat supply agreement in place as part of regulation. Just make sure, A, you've got one, or if you haven't got one, start pulling one together. There is a whole authorization condition section on that. It is going to have to be bespoke. I know people have been calling on for a template. Ofgem will do a template, but I guarantee you that will only give you 20% of what you need, because it's got to reflect your conditions, the suppliers that you've got, the terms that you've got in those contracts, and all of those sorts of things. So don't rely on Ofgem coming up with a, you know, boilerplate that you can just stick your name on it. It is more difficult and complicated than that. But let's try not to let the lawyers have too much of a field day with heat supply agreements. It should be something that you can broadly do yourself, even if you get them to ultimately check it. So if you don't have one, get one. If you've got one, get it reviewed internally to do that. Scheme information and performance, you know, that we started with this point around, you know, not having the information, and, you know, it's not surprising people don't have heat network information, because nobody's ever asked for it before, right? You know, it's just been a line or a column potentially, or sometimes not even that, you know, in an asset database. So, you know, get the evidence so that you're in a defendable position. Assess and identify schemes, you know, where they are, the location, you know, are they extra care, are they supported housing, are they general needs, what's the age of them, you know, bad spelling there, apologies, or typo. Get that asset register in place with all of that information in there. A lot of it will already be existing. Our experience is that a lot of it won't, and ultimately somebody somewhere is going to have to go in the plant room or check the scheme, and, you know, just to go and have a look. There is a big disparity between what people think they've got and what actually exists, even down to whether they've got schemes or not. It's the number one thing that comes up when we do a board presentation, is that somebody sits in the room and goes, yeah, but you've forgotten about Acacia Avenue. We don't own that anymore. Or what about Acacia Avenue? You haven't got that on your list. Because again, heat networks have not been something that people have had to report on. So it's not been in that data. Assess scheme efficiency. That can be a simple desktop initially, just to get that sense, you know, is it 20% efficient or is it 50% efficient? That's going to be, you know, massive defense piece in working out, you know, what tariffs and service charges are being charged. Ensure asset and repair systems have heat networks flagged. I know that's easier said than done, and, you know, asset systems, they never like more stuff being added to their schemes. The reality is that that's going to have to be something that people do for regulation anyway. So even if it's just starting that process now, engaging with the supplier. And again, I don't underestimate how difficult that particular challenge is. Finance data and costs, complete financial reconciliation of all schemes, both individually and collectively. You know, what's coming in and what's going out. Starting to understand what the costs are, what you're being charged for metering and billing, what you're spending on repairs. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to have everything. It's just that start of, right, what's the balance sheet of our schemes? Yes, have an eye on the things that they're going to ask you to include as part of fair pricing. But again, it's having that defensible position and the sector having that credibility to say, yeah, we do know, you know, what the costs are for our heat networks. You know, we know that what you've suggested in the fair pricing is not necessarily the best solution. because they will ask that question. Is, you know, if we're arguing that what they're proposing is not good, they'll just simply go, well, show us the evidence of, you know, what you've got. And if we can't come up with that evidence, it's not a good position to be in. Identifying cost existing third-party suppliers. In some senses, that's an easier, you know, existing contracts for metering and billing and repairs, but also review the contracts. Yeah, it's going to be one of the most important things for example, guaranteed standards of performance as well, and begin, excuse me, begin building the data requirements for reporting. Again, not heavy, but just that build on that asset register of heat networks you've got, and, you know, just checking how you're doing in terms of, you know, current regulation, etc., etc. I think I've got two more, haven't I? Yeah, readiness and roles, complete the regulation readiness review. So checking on those schemes. Have you done the OPSS return? You know, have you done the cost effectiveness assessment for schemes as it is? Do you know what you're doing on individual metering? Do you know if they're, you know, extra care, supported housing, and just, you know, so that you've got that understanding where you currently stand. Sure, the board is aware. You know, that somebody at some point will start asking the questions of why are we starting to get all of these complaints? Why have we got a formal redress process from the energy ombudsman that goes straight to the chief exec? We know, you know, we always have to have an answer. If the chief exec asks you a question, you always have to have three answers to it. Yes, we're looking at it. Yes, we understand where we're at, and yes, we know what we're going to do about it. You know, standing there not knowing that is coming is the least defensible position. I've been there. You don't want to do it. Internal communication to outline what is coming in the roles of, you know, finance, asset management. We know all of this touches on so many different departments and what people are doing, who sets the tariffs and who does the service charges, you know, who's doing the repairs and maintenance, who's doing the sinking fund for asset management. You know, there's a lot of people who have a small bit to do with all of this. Again, this is not something that will happen overnight and it's all resolved by next Thursday. It's about starting that journey so that, again, you can say, we're doing this, we're on our way with this, this is our commitment to doing this. So hopefully don't pick on us. But right, last one, I think, is a quick summary. Right. You know, let's try and be the optimist for the final bit of this. This is all part of the professionalization of heat network management and consumer protection. You know, we all on a good day, you know, say this is something we definitely needed doing, and regulation is forcing us to do it. And it you know, it's not going to be avoidable. But let's turn it into a positive. You know, we want heat networks to be better. We want them to be delivering affordable, reliable, low carbon heating. You know, for the most part, they're not living up to that promise. Let's see if we can get them to do that. And, you know, let's use the lever of regulation to get some of those resources internally as well. It does create significant challenges. We've touched on all of those today. You know, I don't think we're quite at the tip of the iceberg. We're maybe at the water level of the iceberg. I think there's a lot more things that will come out as we look at the sheer detail of this. I think, you know, going back to Ofgem with lots of concerns, hopefully supported by data as well, and just trying to offer an alternative scenario where we go, we need more information, we need more data for this, so that we are having a positive conversation with Ofgem. That point about the sector needs to show it's working towards shared goal and undertaking best endeavours. You know, we can't ask for changes if we're not speaking from a position of commitment to the overall aims and objectives of the regulation. Key actions in short term, they're needed anyway. I know that doesn't make them any easier, but, you know, at least there is now a good justification internally for doing those. And the first rule of new regulation is, well, don't be the one to get caught. So that's where we're done. I'm not sure why that slides in at the end. I think that's just a simple approach that we take. There we go. Rach, did you want to finish up?
Thank you. Just to say thank you very much. And a small plug, we do have an insight group where we you know, we send out briefings on things like this. So if anybody would like to join, you're very welcome to. There's a QR code there, and we're happy to share. But that's it. There's a couple of questions. I know we're at 3 o'clock, so I think if we let those people go who need to go, my email address is already in the chat, but we'll circulate it with the slides. Did you want to say anything, Bethan?
Just a big thank you to everyone. What will happen now is Nick and Rachel are going to put the consultation response together for us. I will send that out to all of you in the whole Future Homes and Regulation groups for comment. And I will also circulate the slides from today as well.